Goed, baie dankie vir die geleentheid. Ek het die wonderlike voorreg gehad.
Thank you for the opportunity to be talking to you today, and I would like to acknowledge the fact that the namesake of this conference, Jack Steyn, I was a young man when I first met Jack, and we got onto his farm, a group of us, ready with all the knowledge contained in at that stage about soil, fertilization, everything. Walking onto his farm with all these knowledge and ready to go, and he starts off with telling us, listen, I'm moving over to stubble tillage. This threw us for a loop. We knew that at that stage that we had to plow and that we had to burn the stubble. This changed the whole picture for us, and that made me realize that you may have all the knowledge, but you need the practical side as well. Up to this day, Jack stays one of the role models that inspired me to do what I do. So from this conversation with Jack Steyn, I came to a conclusion to have this personal drive, not to focus on doing the right things, because everyone can do that. But the challenge would be like to take one of these right things and make sure that we do that to the best of our ability. And this is where Jack came in the fact that he could do all the right things, but he wanted to change. And nothing was in the book, so he had to do it from scratch. And that was a motivation for me as well, to challenge the existing knowledge. So I decided then that to stay relevant and to stay sustainable, you have to do the best you can in terms of what is happening in the world. So the question now is, are those basics that we knew then, are they still relevant today? Firstly, the CN ratio. Does it still determine the quality of the compost or the composting that happens in our soil, the residue that's left there? Are we applying it in the same way that we did then? Secondly, does the organic matter in the soil still have the advantages in crop production that it had at that stage? We used to burn and till the soil, and does it now make changes to how we do it today? At that stage, we had to plow the soil because the fertilizer was broadcast as well as the seed, and we had to close that or cover that with the soil. With the coming of the tine seeder over time, it made it a lot easier to handle the residue in the soil, and it was much better in terms of lowering the amount of tillage that's happening. But you still had some disturbance of the soil, which made you feel all right about it. With the coming of this seeder, I realized that we are starting to have problems, especially on the fertilizer side of the equation. Well, is it still true, or is it true that the higher in the carbon-nitrogen ratio, if the amount of nitrogen, which is the divider in the ratio, is higher, then the ratio is so much lower? And does it still result in a better compost or not? Well, if the ratio gets lower, there's one or two possibilities. Either you had a loss of carbon out of the system, or there's a lower amount of nitrogen available. Fertilizer is expensive, and in a commercial setup, a farmer needs to make certain decisions on that. Now the question is, with all these attributes that commercial fertilizer had, does it still leach? Does it still go through ammonification, volatilization, nitrification? And are these still the characters of a nitrogen fertilizer? If this is still true, then we need to change our practices, because the fertilizer hasn't changed, so we have to change our practice. That is the question of how do we do that. And further on is urease still an important enzymatic process for the conversion of urea. And then the question is the conversion of ureum through the urease activity, the enzymatic activity. Is it still an important process? This is important because urea is still the most used fertilizer source around, and that is still important then because that gives the energy that is needed to do the conversion. And finally, does a fertilizer still have the salt index it had previously? And if so, it can lead to seed scorching, which can have detrimental effects to germination. And we have to look at that. The question now is why. So if this is true and it still has a high salt index, which can lead to seed scorching, doesn't it make sense to take the fertilizer away from the seed then? The question is now is why. Why would we take the fertilizer away from the seed? To answer this, I want to refer to an explanation that I got from a farmer near Caledon, Corvus Wessels, about the seedbed utility. We still get the same yields, but we have changed our row spacings. What this means is that if you take the distance between two tines, as illustrated in the figure, it is roughly 300 millimeters, and of that, the tine work, say, 65 millimeters of that spacing. It results in a seedbed utility of 21.7%. This means we cannot, as we done previously when broadcasting 60 kilograms of N, now put 60 kilograms of nitrogen into the row anymore. This interested me a lot, and realized we need to look at how do we go from here. If we leave that 60 kilograms in the row, we're not going to have any seed left. So how do we operate from here on out? You can still choose between products, but which will deliver the nitrogen in different ways, but the main effect you have to look at is the practice. So what determines the CN ratio in practice? Everything we know about nitrogen comes from nature. Nature teaches us everything. So what determines this? Firstly is crop rotation. Certainly the most important of this is the crop rotation, and especially with legumes, which results in higher nitrogen within the soil, much higher than you would get following a cereal crop. But on the other hand, the legume doesn't have a lot of organic matter. Next important thing is, how did the previous crop perform? The amount of fertilizer applied in the previous crop will have a direct influence on the CN ratio of the residue following harvest. So 2018 was a good example where I received a lot of samples from across the province, and what was interesting was in the higher rainfall areas where the guys applied more in, the CN ratio was of wheat, which is normally about 80:1, was more like 40:1. And this was still better than in the areas where there was lower rainfall in 2017. This resulted in a wider range of CN ratios within the higher rainfall areas and a narrower band in the lower rainfall areas. But this led me to the conclusion that carbon in the organic material is a perfect carrier for extra nitrogen from one year to the following year. This means that we can carry over nitrogen in a year where you have given nitrogen that was not used and that becomes available in the following year. This means that the value of the residue must not be underappreciated. This brings us to the current crop practices. So, planting with a tine planter, there is still incorporation of stubble, and it forces you to adjust your view in terms of fertilization, because although there's a part of the soil that's thrown over on top of the stubble in between the rows, it doesn't mean that there's less stubble. That stubble still needs to be composted. What this means that there must be extra in the system to ensure that the residue breaks down and forms part of the soil instead of having it go up in the air as carbon dioxide. When you don't incorporate the stubble, that's not an issue. Well, let's look at the contribution of legumes. Everyone knows that it binds atmospheric nitrogen through rhizobia, and this helps with the sustainability and making sure that there's available in the soil to keep the CN ratio going. This means, for example, if you have a legume in the system, the CN ratio may be 35:1, But as you increase the carbon in the system through cereals and increase this residue, the C potential is increased, but it means that there's less N or nitrogen available, which plays havoc with the C-N ratio. So the following years, the C-N ratio is dominated by the stubble. The soil nitrogen is used to decompose all the material, and thus the soil N decreases to such extent that the C-N ratio increases. This means that we need more N. Keep incorporating or decomposting the residue, because if the nitrogen becomes less in the system, the increase in the C-N ratio doesn't allow for proper incorporation or improvement of the carbon in the soil. What this means is that if you don't have a legume in the system, you will have to look at adding extra nitrogen into the system to help with the decomposing of the residue, especially if you're in a cereal rotation. So, if the previous crop was a grass, it means you have a high C-N ratio, and to sequestrate the carbon in the system or from the stubble or residue that's left, one has to make sure that there's enough N available to do that sequestration. We were following and ploughing and burning the stubble. These C-N ratios were very low, unless N had to be applied, because we were basically on a fallow system where it meant there was very little organic matter that needed to be broken down. Just think about it. If you still burn, you're losing cover, which has certain effects, but you're also losing organic matter, and that organic matter is the energy of the system. So by burning it, you actually are poorer in what you're doing than if you don't burn. So taking into consideration the previous crop and the amount of stubble left, we need that to calculate how much nitrogen we would need to break that stubble down. Grazing or baling the stubble also play a role in determining how much nitrogen you need to break the stubble down that goes into the soil. There's two ways of determining how much stubble you have left, either measuring it on a given area or calculating it from the previous year's crop. So at planting, it must be noted that there is much more incorporation with the tine than disc seeder, so the demand is higher for N at planting with the tine than the disc. Be careful of the amount of nitrogen that's going into the furrow. Keep the seedbed cool by placing the minimum amount of nitrogen in the furrow. So my advice would be to give some N prior to plant. We call it pre-plant or pre-casting a certain amount over the whole area, or you can top dress it as soon as practically possible following planting. This is especially true if you're scared of leaching in sandier soils, but we have to remember that doesn't matter what product you use, the same features of the product is still in play. This could mean that if you're planting in difficult conditions where there's too little water, it can volatilize, or if it's too much water, it can leach, or if your pH is not correct, it can play a role as well. So after planting, I would suggest you keep soil temperature and pH in mind, and then choose between the sources, possible sources for your top dressing. And as an example, we will look at the following. Remember, we are in a winter rainfall region, which comes with lower temperatures. So if you're using or thinking about using urea, you might want to avoid it if you're on high pH soils or your soil temperature is less than 10 degrees Celsius, because you will lose effectiveness of that top dressing. So it's also important to determine your in-season efficiency of your nitrogen applications, because you have only so much time to do that. And we've benefited from using NDVIs and analysis of leaf tissue and chlorophyll readings. When you go to a farmer to assess what needs to be done, rather use your process data that you've collected to evaluate your own efficiency, and not necessarily the data that comes to the gate as science. It is so much more important to evaluate it on farm because of the specific climate and situation you are in. And that is rather important to me, because it means that I can come with data to you on the farm, but it is data that's generated maybe at another spot, and it necessarily doesn't reflect what has been happening in your area. So that means that you have to keep in mind what your crop did this year, what's left following that, and that will determine what you're going to do the next year. But it's also important to keep the environmental conditions into consideration, and that includes things like day length or due to foggy conditions or rainy days, etc. That all plays a role in terms of how your effectiveness will play out. We started off by saying that we have to get the CN ratio correct, because that is the factory of energy on the farm. But we also have to get the plant in a condition that it can deliver for the farmer. So my suggestion would be, when it's cold and there's not a lot of sunshine around, to maybe look at foliar applications of 10 kilograms of urea diluted in 100 liters of water per hectare, and then include organic substances like molasses and sugars and organic acids. We're starting off with an organic idea in terms of the CN ratio, so keep that going with the additives. Other considerations we might take into account is analyzing our soil nitrogen and carbon together, and include the soil density determinations, and you can then calculate and make use of expertise in the area to assist you to come to a soil nitrogen strategy for your farm, for your practices and your climate. We must just be aware that rising the nitrogen levels, although it makes the plant look greener and smarter, it also plays a direct effect on the availability of some other nutrients, especially potassium, copper, and boron. Remember, if the higher you go with your nitrogen, it will have an inversely negative effect on the availability of these three elements, and especially in the Southern Cape and even in the Swartland, we are struggling to lift our copper and boron levels. In summary, here I'm going to talk a little bit of English.
Sustainable practices regarding rely on innovation and efficiency. You can't take the long road with an empty tank and just feel comfortable with the amounts of in. Met ander woorde, do you feel it in?
In other words, the amount of in is not as important as the effectiveness of the in. You can't think that you will give the nitrogen one time in the season and will run through. So we have to use this soil organic matter as the energy to fill up the tank, and the soil in, or the nitrogen available in the soil, as the conductor of this energy, available energy. So it's important to recharge the plant so that it functions as optimally as you can according to the conditions that is at the order of the day, so that in the end you ensure the best return of your inputs and you get the cost benefit of what you're doing. I still believe that in-season monitoring is one of the best management practices one can do. Just not walking through the crop, but actually taking measurements. And that is a sound way of making sure that you obtain the results that you're looking for. So remember, make use of the expertise that is available in the market and make sure that you do so in order that you can maximize your efficiency. And all of us has a stake in agriculture and has a love for agriculture. So make that work. I thank you.